Good evening. I'm Isabella Piañones with the Engagement Department at the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to this evening's virtual lecture celebrating the exhibition Toulouse-Lautrec and the Celebrity Culture of Paris. We'd like to start by thanking the Allan McNab Endowed Fund for generously supporting Toulouse-Lautrec and the Celebrity Culture of Paris. We're so glad to have you all joining us virtually, and while we wish that we could welcome you in person, we hope that this digital format can offer a chance to stay connected to the Art Institute from home. We'll begin with a brief review of some of the features we'll be using today. This program will be shared in presentation mode, so we have turned off video and microphone for attendees. For optimal viewing, please select full screen mode under View Options in the top right corner of your screen. Throughout the presentation, you're invited to share questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we look forward to answering some of those at the end of this presentation. Closed captions are available and can be turned on via the controls at the bottom of the screen as well. If you encounter any technical difficulties during today's program, again, please let us know in the Q&A and we'll do our best to assist you. This program is being recorded, so if you'd like to revisit in the future, you'll be welcome to do so. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Emerson Bowyer, Searle Associate Curator of Painting and Sculpture of Europe, and J.A. Clarke, Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Izzy. We're delighted to be with you all this evening to celebrate the Allan McNab virtual lecture. It's kind of hard to imagine the vibrant streets of 1890s Paris and the Café Concerts and the exciting dance halls of Montmartre were all stuck indoors in the middle of winter, but hopefully this will bring a little bit of liveliness to your evenings while most of us are indoors. And the exciting thing is, if you can, please go to the next slide, Devin. The exciting thing is, you all probably know, is that the Art Institute is now open again. So you can see this exhibition and many others in addition to our permanent collection. This exhibition, Toulouse-Lautrec and the Celebrity Culture of Paris, will be open through June 28th, 2021. And what you see on your slide are a few installation shots that I snapped last week. I know I did not ask the people standing there for their permission. So hopefully they are on this call. But this just gives you a sense of what the installation looks like around the room. And as many of you know, this gallery usually holds our wonderful Monet paintings. And because the Monet exhibition is open right now, Monet in Chicago, this room was empty. So we decided to fill it up with wonderful Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings and posters. So that's sort of one of the things we're celebrating this evening. So I'm going to pass it over to Emerson.
And I guess the overriding idea for the presentation was the idea of the phenomenon of celebrity in the late 19th century in Paris. And of course, we all know what celebrity is today. I mean, we're all familiar with reality TV stars and actors and actresses and musicians. Many of us watch Real Housewives of whatever. But the idea of celebrity was fairly new in the late 19th century. For centuries beforehand, people had subscribed to a very different idea of notoriety, and that was the idea of fame, which was being renowned and recognized for one's heroic actions, whether it be in the military or outstanding moral character. It was really the province of generals, royalty. Celebrity, on the other hand, is a completely different concept. It's much more democratic. Anyone can be a celebrity. It's the status of being a well-known personality. It doesn't depend on great morally good deeds or military victories. It's just about being constantly in the public eye. And I think the development of the mass media in the 19th century, prints, photography, journals, newspapers, gossip columns, had so much to do with this. Celebrity is ultimately ephemeral. as opposed to the more traditionally eternal quality of fame. And so I think it's perfectly embodied in what we're talking about today for the most part, which are posters, which were really only designed to be up for a short period of time. Next slide.
So I think many of us can visualize these wide open Parisian boulevards like we see in Caillebott's our own iconic Paris Street Rainy Day, or Pissarro's Boulevard, where you can see for, you know, miles and miles this idea of real openness. But if you can go to the next slide, please. But the streets of 1890s Montmartre were quite different. Montmartre is in the north of Paris, in the hilly 18th arrondissement. And the landscapes at the time were, as you can see on the photograph at right, still dotted with windmills and small individual farms. So the windmills provided power for what was partly a working class rural society that depended on milling grain and the like for their sustenance, mostly for processing grapes and the like to make wine. And then on the right, you see the narrow streets, very dissimilar to the open boulevards we saw in the last two images by Caillebott and Pissarro. And we see the beautiful Sacré-Cœur at the very end of this image. Next slide, please. So the real epicenter of the nightlife that grew around this area and became home to Toulouse-Lautrec and his friends was the Moulin Rouge. And as we can see on the right, it very much came from the windmills that powered these working class neighborhoods that we saw before. And the poster at right is a very famous image of the Bal Moulin Rouge by Jules Chéret. And here again, we see some of these nightlife entertainments and the windmill, which again became this sort of icon. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of how some of these posters were consumed at the time, here we see a painting by not a very well-known artist, Carrier-Belleuse. And we see a sort of bourgeois couple looking at these images that were plastered on the walls. And it gives you a sense, as Emerson was saying, the very ephemeral nature of fame. These were plastered on the walls. They were mostly destroyed. You think of the wind and the rain and the elements and everything affecting these. And it just sort of gave people an idea of what they were going to do, how they're going to dress their hair, how they were going to, how they're going to entertain themselves. Next slide, please. And this is another photograph by the well-known artist, photographer Eugène Atget. And here we see the very same posters plastered on the walls. And again, many of them were destroyed. And that's part of the reason it's rare to see these posters in such excellent condition as the ones in the Art Institute, because they were really sort of destroyed over time. Next slide, please. And here we see our protagonist on the left, Toulouse-Lautrec. This is a photograph of him. He came to Paris, he moved to Paris in 1882. And although he frequented the cafes and brothels of Montmartre and all over Paris, he came, as many of you may know, from a very aristocratic family. And here we see his father in the middle and his mother on the right. And they did not approve of his career whatsoever as an artist. And his mother particularly took great interest early in his life. Before he moved to Paris, he was an artist early on, was very interested in making drawings, but she became very concerned about his physical well-being because she saw some hindrances to his growth. And when he was riding, he broke both of his legs. And as you can see here in this photograph, he was short of stature and he was unable to grow after these two riding incidents. And part of the reason was probably genetic. His parents, they were very aristocratic and they were first cousins, which may seem shocking now, but it was not at all unusual at the time. And so that was probably, he also had a speech impediment. He had a variety of physiological and probably neurological issues, which may have been the result of his parents being first cousins. We can go to the next slide.
But Toulouse-Lautrec, he just, despite the problems, probably, he used many of his physical attributes, I think, and in a somewhat positive way, in order to, self-fashion and create a kind of persona for himself among the denizens of Montmartre. Here on the right, you can see him wearing a hat and scarf belonging to one of the most notorious can-can dancers of the period, Jane Avril. I think it really speaks to the idea that the Toulouse-Lautrec's celebrity was inherently, symbiotically connected to the celebrity of the sitters that he pursued. Every time he produced an image of one of the famous actors, actresses, dancers of the period, the poster became popular, and so his own celebrity was bolstered by the images he produced of the celebrities around him. He actively promoted his art, encouraging articles about his posters. He exhibited them and his other works in a variety of venues, and often sold reduced versions of the posters, to audiences that wanted to take a little piece of his work home with them, but also to take an image of their favorite celebrity home with them as well. So he constantly courted, I think, in a very creative way, his own popularity and infamy. And I think that this image on the right is a perfect example of the sort of performative nature of not just the people he depicted, but of Toulouse-Lautrec himself. Next slide. This is one of my favorite paintings on the left that you're probably all familiar with, that is with us here in Chicago. And on the right is the first major success Toulouse-Lautrec had as a producer of publicity posters. It is designed to promote the Moulin Rouge, which Jay just mentioned to you. Today, the most famous of all 19th century Parisian entertainment venues, popularized, most recently by Baz Luhrmann's, film Moulin Rouge. It was a place where people of all classes could mix together, and the rich could come just for the evening and sort of live out their fantasies of, living a demi-monde life. The print was produced in about 3,000 copies, and they were all sort of plastered around Paris in a few evenings in late December 1891. It was an overnight success and gained Toulouse-Lautrec great notoriety. Firstly, I think because of its size. It's massive. It's almost 2 meters high. It's actually composed of 3 separate sheets of paper. So, this is not an easily produced work. And if you can, and it hadn't been attempted on this scale before, really, I don't think. So you can imagine it suddenly dwarfing every other poster on the walls on which it was posted. And I think that was somewhat shocking to people. Immediately, you can see his brilliance in graphic design. Here we have an incredibly reduced composition, flat areas of color. It's spatially ambiguous. The yellow lights on the left, are we looking at them from above? Are we looking at them from eye level? The sweeping planks of the floor, rushing backwards, the use of bold silhouettes. And it's really focused on the star quality of the performers at the venue. So in the center of the poster, you see La Goulou, who was the most famous and notorious dancer of the moment, and she performed at that point at the Moulin Rouge. And here you see her in the absolute center, executing one of her best-known tricks. She is kicking one leg up high in the air, and she was known for these kicks, which sometimes she would do to knock the top hats off customers in the bar around her. Sometimes it was said she forgot to wear underpants at all to the performances. So I think that there is, this is a poster that's dripping in sexual innuendo. We are literally asked to look up the skirts of La Goulou, and I think that this was very well known for Toulouse-Lautrec's contemporaries. Our particular version of the poster has a Moulin Rouge stamp that one of the workers is affixed to it right on her backside. So I think that, that this was a club that was associated with sex and fun and naughtiness. And this poster, I think, just sums it all up in the most frenetic, exciting way that really plays with the movement of the dancer herself that people were coming to see.
If I
on
can
the left,
jump in on
yes, please.
One, since you're talking about the sort of scandalous nature of this poster, Emerson, I think it's interesting to note that his right hand is pointing underneath her skirts, and his left hand is suggesting something else altogether excitable that I will not mention on this PG screen.
Well, and this is the kind of innuendo that the citizens of Paris, and particularly those who frequented these clubs, were very, very used to. I mean, these were very witty establishments. Everyone spoke in double entendres. So Toulouse-Lautrec is really playing with the language that his viewers understood. And on the left, you see the great painting at the Moulin Rouge, which gives us a view into the club itself. It is an extraordinary image, not just because of its completely unconventional composition, but because it is truly a modern update on the very idea of the group portrait. Here, Toulouse-Lautrec is showing a group of the celebrities that he hung out with and people that he made posters depicting. You can see La Goulou in the background. You can see the back of Jane Avril, with her trademark red hair. In the foreground, with the most gloriously garish face of the 19th century, is May Milton, a singer. And it's really interesting to me that this is both a portrait and a genre scene. And unlike, for example, 17th century Dutch group portraits where all the members of a club or a militia would sort of line up next to each other looking out at the viewer, here Toulouse-Lautrec is giving us something a little more private. It kind of almost looks to me like one of those paparazzi photographs of people having lunch that you see in Hello Mag about performance. And here Toulouse-Lautrec is really staking out his position as part of this group of celebrity figures. You can actually see him in the center background, dwarfed by the tall man standing next to him. You can see him just there, the smaller figure. So this is also a self-portrait, and it's him claiming his position as, in a sense, the official court portraitist to these infamous characters that everybody knew. Next slide. One thing I wanted to just briefly mention is that this painting was always considered, a little risque, a little problematic, and difficult. And what we have today in the museum is the full painting, but it has been restored. In the late 19th century, we think Toulouse-Lautrec's dealer cut out the extreme left-hand side and the bottom of the canvas to get rid of the more controversial compositional elements, such as, May Milton's frightening face and the sort of expanse of the bar at the bottom. So, and you can sort of see an example of what it might have looked like on the right. But thankfully, in the early 20th century, all the pieces were brought back together. So we have the full painting now in all its glory, and it's so much more exciting than it was in its cropped format. Next slide.
So as we talked, we've already mentioned her before. This is Jeanne Avril. And Toulouse-Lautrec probably met her at the Moulin Rouge. They became very close friends. And she was one of the early promoters or one of the early artists, dancers to commission him to help spread her fame. Jean Avril's mother was likely a prostitute, and she left the family at the age of 13. And she was admitted to a mental hospital specifically for women and for prostitutes at the time, who unfortunately, they were probably not mentally ill. They probably just, were homeless at the time. In any case, while she was in the hospital, she was brought in for it was known as a disease at the time, which is sort of a bodily jerking and bodily movements. And she was understood to have gotten over this physical condition through dance. This could very well be apocryphal. It kind of sounds like it is. But she was said to have, gotten over her condition through dance. And then this became her career. And on the left, we see her doing this high kick again. And on the right, an early, again, a large scale poster of her doing one of her dances, kicking her leg up. And I think on the right, it's quite amazing how Toulouse-Lautrec encircles this composition. We have the musician at the lower right, who's sort of caricatural in his face, and his instrument in turn serves as the frame for the image. And then the bridge between the stage and the instrument, you'll see on the lower left, is the artist's signature. It looks like JAC, it's Toulouse-Lautrec. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. So he's putting himself as the maker right there in the image. You can go to the next slide, please. These are more images of Jean Avril. This is one, a group scene we have on the left. And then on the right, I think it's interesting that what Toulouse-Lautrec does is he very much creates the stereotype, the brand of the artist, as you will. She had this slender body, this serpentine movement, again, a serpent around her body, this sort of shocking reddish, in this case, it looks more blondish, but this at the time, shocking red hair, which it was a bit of a signifier for prostitution at the time in any case. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And here we see another image of Jean Avril. Here she is part of an audience. She's looking on at another performance, the Divan Japonais. And here she is, a more sort of aristocratic woman in her own right, watching another performer on the stage. And I juxtapose this with the poster artist who was very well known at the time, who we mentioned before, was Jules Chéret. And what he did is he kind of idealized these particular figures. They were sort of every performer, every person, and they didn't have any individuality. But what Toulouse-Lautrec did, as Emerson was saying before, is he kind of turned these figures into a brand, and that brand is what brought people to their performances. So he was creating the brand in order to produce this kind of celebrity culture that then brought money to the performers and brought money to the places where they performed and engendered this celebrity culture. So next image, please.
So this is another example of what Jay was talking about, which is Toulouse-Lautrec really distilling his images of these celebrities into the very physical essence that they were most famous for, whether it be their dance moves or the look of their body or the clothing that they wore. This is another great example of this, which is a series of portraits that Toulouse-Lautrec made of the infamous singer, songwriter, and entrepreneur Aristide Bruant. Bruant had become the proprietor of a nightclub called Le Mirliton, but he continued to perform as well. And he began to receive contracts to perform at much higher class venues outside of Montmartre, ritzier cafes like the Ambassadors and things like that. And to advertise those performances, he contracted Toulouse-Lautrec to produce portraits advertising them. And if we go to the next slide, and these performances, it has to be said, it was a way for the more uptight middle and upper classes to go to a cafe that they were familiar with and just get sort of dip their toes in, demi-monde culture. They'd go to a very familiar place. They didn't have to go to shady Montmartre. And they could get just a taste of what was going on, a few arrondissements over. What you see here are two versions, two different posters, but using a very similar composition. On the right is the first one that Toulouse-Lautrec produced. It's an advertisement for Aristide Bruant doing his cabaret at a cafe called the Ambassadeur. Again, these are gigantic posters, very, very large. And their sense of monumentality doesn't just come from their physical size. It comes from the composition as well. Here again, Toulouse-Lautrec is simplifying everything to the most basic components of what made Aristide Bruant famous. Here he is in his signature wide-brimmed hat, his red scarf, the scowl on his face that he was known for. At his own club, he would sort of wander around berating the customers, and they seem to enjoy it. I don't quite understand, but so you sort of get a sense of the sort of haughty character of the man as well. Again, simplified to sort of flat planes of color. He's depicted 3/4 length, his body filling the entire poster, and we're almost sort of led to believe that we're looking up at him as if he's much grander and larger than life. And in the background, you see a sort of shadowy man leaning against a wall in what could be an alley or a doorway. And it's just giving you a little whiff of, the sort of shady underbelly of Montmartre, where he comes from. These were overnight successes, these images. Aristide was immensely pleased with them, and even began selling small-scale versions to customers at his club and things like that. Next slide.
We saw May Milton earlier. Emerson was describing the Art Institute famous Moulin Rouge painting. She was an American performer, and she commissioned this poster on the left for a performance that never actually materialized. But I think it's interesting to see the idealized or the image that Toulouse-Lautrec makes on the left, and then the amazingly sensitive drawing that he does of her on the right with this really searing self-portrait. You sort of see the lifestyle. She looks very tired, not at all glamorous. Next slide, please. And I think it's important that to understand how incredibly influential these posters were. They were, whether this this performance actually happened at all on the left of May Milton is perhaps irrelevant, because artists like Picasso, living in Montmartre and being enormously influenced by Toulouse-Lautrec, as you can see the Picasso painting, The Blue Room from 1901, from his blue period, you see the poster of May Milton on the wall behind him. So he himself collected these images. Next slides, please. This is May Belfour. We have just a couple more images. And she was quite a hysterical performer. She always had a giant childlike bonnet on her head, and she carried a black cat in her arms. And apparently her singing was so bad, it sounded very much like a screaming cat that she was carrying. So we have an image on the left, and then another repurposed image like the Aristide Bruant for another performance. So again, these images were used sort of again and again for different purposes. Next slide. This is one of my favorites. This is the one poster not by Toulouse-Lautrec in the exhibition. It's by the poster artist Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. And here we see an incredibly unlikely and bizarre array of characters advertising none other but canned sardines. First of all, disgusting in my book, but it's just interesting because these days we see actors and actresses advertising some of the strangest things, but it didn't really matter. If they were going to sell sardines, it doesn't, it would work. So here we have from left to right, the politician, Sidi Albay, the singer and performer Yvette Guibert, the politician Henri Rochefort, Sarah Bernhardt next to him, and then of course Aristide Bruant, of course selling sardines. Next slide, please.
So we have a couple of paintings up in the galleries right now that you're also probably familiar with, and they deal with another of Toulouse-Lautrec's favorite venues in Montmartre, which was the Circus. And he was also extremely interested in the personalities and celebrities that were emerging from the Circus at that moment. It's, I think, difficult to adequately impart how popular and important the Circus was at the end of the 19th century in Paris. I mean, for many critics, it was considered to be more vibrant and more creative than the opera, than the theater, than the ballet. You know, it was seen that more interesting things were going on at the Circus, which is not necessarily how we think of it today, I guess. Lautrec was a regular visitor to one particular circus, which was the Cirque Fernando in Montmartre. It was a sort of, not one of the higher class, grand, older circuses. It was a step below that. It was a younger circus, and it began with just tents, very close to the Moulin Rouge, I think. And then they built a permanent structure for it a few years later because it became so popular. This painting itself was purchased to hang in the interior of the Moulin Rouge. So it's an extraordinary moment where the various entertainment genres or venues of the neighborhood are coming together and shedding light on each other. Which I think is really wonderful. Here you can see an incredibly dynamic composition, cropped very roughly at each edge, and the sort of extraordinary circular rushing movement of this horse going round and round and round the ring. The rider on the horse is, we think, was posed or modeled by Suzanne Valadon, who went on to become a well-known artist in her own right, visual artist. This is a work which is sort of about sex, it's about display, but it also has a kind of a disturbing underside to it as well. It's fairly ambiguous as to how we're supposed to respond to it or what its meaning might be. The rider on the horse is shown, with a bare bottom, long, naked legs. She's astride a horse. It's very clearly a male horse. We can see his private parts hanging out the back. So there is a lot of innuendo going on here about the sexuality of women and animals. I mean, it's sort of femme fatale kind of territory, but it's not necessarily all fun. You can see that the audience is almost completely comprised of men. And so she's kind of alone in this arena as a woman, but at the same time, they don't even seem to really be looking at her. And the man in the foreground on the left is the proprietor of the Cirque Fernando and the ringleader, Fernando himself. And there's something almost masochistic about his interaction with the horse and the rider. In fact, he was quite infamous for having horses that performed very, very well, but due to very ill mistreatment, essentially, of his animals. And so there's sort of a sense that comes across of that as well. But it would have been an extraordinary image to see hanging on the wall in the Moulin Rouge. It was probably hung fairly high because the viewpoint is such that you feel like you need to be looking up at the image. Next slide. And we were very fortunate somewhat recently, about 10 years ago, to purchase this really quite wonderful and weird object. It is a tambourine on which Toulouse-Lautrec has painted a very similar image to the Circus image painting that we just looked at. He was not the first person to paint on a tambourine in the 19th century. The Impressionists, Manet, others were sometimes making these kind of objects, I suspect to give as gifts to friends. And the closeness of this work to the painted composition suggests that perhaps it was a souvenir for somebody who either admired the painting at the Moulin Rouge or admired the circus, this particular circus itself. What I love about it is, you know, the function of the object is so perfect for the subject matter. The circus was an utterly multi-sensory experience, and you know, to use this functional object, which you know makes noise, that one can interact with. It has all the sort of percussive and musical qualities of the circus itself at that time. Next slide.
Let's skip this slide and go on to the last one, because I want to be sure we have time to answer questions from our audience.
I think we're ready to receive questions, Jay. What do you think?
Do it.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation. Let's start these questions off with, what is it about Toulouse-Lautrec's work, particularly his posters, that maintains such a place in today's pop culture?
That's a good question. I mean, they've been popular all along. As I was mentioning, you know, Picasso collected them. They've been collected and admired for so long. And I think there's a real timelessness to their graphic power. The lettering, the repetition, his use of the same stone for different kinds of images, his own internal repetition of his imagery. I think they're lasting, they're, you know, to be very banal, they're colorful, they're big, they're powerful, they're attractive. So I think there's a lot of different elements that go into it.
We're all very used to you know, post-Disney cartoons and things like that, and I think that, you know, we're very able to appreciate this graphic quality based on, you know, the history of the 20th century, of what came after it as well.
Thank you. Did Toulouse-Lautrec use photographs of models posing for his drawings and paintings, or did he draw from real life?
I think from what I know, he did both. He used photography quite a bit, and there's a fairly interesting body of work about photographs of him in front of posters, photographs of him promoting promotional posters. So I think he very much used photography, but he also used the live model.
And was there a distinction made at the time between Toulouse-Lautrec's commercial work, his posters, and his paintings and drawings, or were the posters seen as more of art at the time?
That's a good question. There were some limited editions he would have made of his posters. So for example, there would have been the ones that it would have been hung on the walls, like the J photographs that we saw. So there was sort of the high-end version that he would sell to collectors, and the lower-end version that would be put on the walls. And as an Emerson said, there were sometimes thousands of these made at the time. But like all artists of his era, color lithography was relatively new in France at the time, and any kind of printmaker at that moment would make 25 on super fancy paper, 50 on less fancy paper, and then 100 on less fancy paper. So there was sort of a price point for the various levels of rarity and the various kinds of papers they were printed on. But if you want to answer about the differentiation between the paintings, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of his work operated in the same media ecology. I mean, all of these works function together to produce a whole. You know, the paintings were shown at the clubs that the posters advertised for. You know, they he would often exhibit the posters and paintings side by side in various locations, whether they be high-end art venues or whether they be clubs and cafe interiors. So I think for a certain type of viewer, they would have been seen as all relating to the same thing. For more conservative viewers, I think there would still have been a huge distinction between the paintings and the posters, for example.
Thank you. And we've had several questions about this. How were these posters so well preserved, and how did they become a part of our collection? And were these posters actually posted, or were they some of those more limited runs?
It's interesting, some of the physical evidence, as Emerson was saying about some of the stamps. There are actual stamps on the front and the back of these posters by the censors. So people, if anything was going to be posted in the outdoors, they had to have a censor stamp on them, just to say these images are okay to be posted on the walls. So some of them, a lot of these posters are that you'll see on the market or in a variety of collections are in horrible condition. Some of ours, most of ours were very lucky or in very good condition. They were either purchased or given to the museum as gifts. So there's as much of a range in condition as you can possibly imagine. But obviously the ones that were hung on the walls outdoors in Paris probably don't exist anymore. They would be, but as I said, there were more limited edition images that he would print that did stand the test of time.
And I think we have time for one final question. Emerson, could you elaborate on the restoration of the Moulin Rouge painting? And do you know where those pieces were hidden?
I think they were still kept together. And it was just that the dealer clearly thought that the work would be more saleable without the pieces on the right and the bottom. But I think they stayed together. And so, around 1914, I think it was decided to put the painting back together again. Thank goodness. So that's not something that we did here at the museum. I think that it was done before we acquired the painting. But thankfully it survives, because it's not the painting makes no sense without those elements on the side and the bottom, which are so extraordinary and what really make that painting the real shocking, extraordinary, wonderful thing that it is.
Thank you again, Jay and Emerson, and thank you all for joining us for this evening's program.
Thanks, everyone. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
As you may already know, the museum reopened earlier this month, and the Toulouse-Lautrec exhibition has been extended through June. We look forward to welcoming many of you back to the galleries. For more information on our upcoming virtual events, please visit us online at artic.edu and look for our monthly e-news in your inboxes. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and have a good night.